Hey guys, LC Holt here, and this is my update for the week of June the 17th. Sitting over here to my right, Rebecca Ivy.
Hello.
So Rebecca, what are we going to talk about today?
Let's go for it.
We're going to talk about the life and crimes of a guy named Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer. So, good Father's Day weekend topic. What we're going to talk about now is we're going to start at the beginning and we're going to try and work our way all the way through. We only have an hour show, so we're going to try to jump right on this. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, May 21st, 1960. He was the first of two sons. Joyce Dahmer was his mother, and Lionel was his father, his middle name. He's named after his father. Now, Joyce was a teletype teacher, and Lionel, when he was born, was a student studying chemistry. Later became a chemist, so he was a very scientifically minded guy. And it's, I think, worth noting, well, definitely worth noting, that these were two very different personality types, Joyce and Lionel. By all accounts, Joyce was a very emotional lady, somewhat needy, and Lionel was a little more reserved, a little more of a science-minded guy who worked on logic, rationale, not someone who had every emotion at his disposal. So pretty early on, their marriage had some issues based probably not solely, but a lot on the fact that they were two different people. In spite of that, they had this child. Now, for a second, I wanted to talk a little bit about something Lionel said later in his book. He said that Joyce had a lot of issues during her first pregnancy. He said that she had seizures, pretty pronounced seizures, that suddenly came on late in the pregnancy, and that she was given, amongst other things, barbiturates and morphine to help with these strange attacks when she was pregnant with Jeffrey. Joyce said, that's not true. Joyce died in 2000 of cancer. Lionel was still alive. But up until her death, Joyce, who is Jeffrey Dahmer's mother, swore that Lionel was lying. And she was very much into, she felt that she was being blamed for what happened to her son in the end. What do you think about that? It's kind of hard to say in hindsight who was telling the truth.
Yeah. No. Who do you believe in that? She would know if she had issues during her pregnancy,
Mm-hmm.
but did she say no, it didn't happen, so she wouldn't be blamed?
Mm-hmm.
But
well,
that's kind of a hard thing to blame someone for.
What?
That the meds it's your fault because of a condition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it does go to that sort of nature versus nurture, and I think the parents always fought against the nurture part of that,
mm-hmm.
because they said, we'll go on into some of the childhood of Jeffrey Dahmer, which I think is apropos at this point when we're talking about nature and nurture, because he was always a very reserved child. According to his early elementary school teachers and such, he was sort of naturally shy and seemed to be basically unhappy. And maybe a lot of the unhappiness early on came from the fact that his mother and father did not get along. There were a lot of shouting matches. Like the impression that I get from it is that she was a little bit of like the crazy-eyed, wild-haired lady who would just go over the top about anything. And he was the kind of guy who was like, why are you angry about that? And, so that would sort of egg her on. His apathy toward her hysterics, her histrionics, would egg her on even more. So they were probably a pretty toxic, couple. Now, that said, Jeffrey did show pretty early on some signs of a fascination in animal bones, In his novel, or not his novel, his memoir, Lionel wrote about an incident where he was going underneath their house to collect the bones of animals that I guess had crawled under there and died. I mean, part of me is like, how many dead animals you got under your house? But apparently he had enough to collect the bones of them and throw them into like this little metal pail. And he said that Jeffrey, as a 4-year-old boy, seemed very fascinated by the sound that these bones made when they dropped in the pail. He'd pick them up and like feel the texture of them, drop them back into the thing. And so that's a pretty young, age to be fascinated with that sort of thing. But then you think, well, children are fascinated with things that they can touch and smell and the sound when it drops. So I think that's one of those things that retroactively you can look back and see what he did with bones and stuff and go, well, that's kind of odd. But then you also think, well, there's probably a lot of children who did a similar thing and never became a serial killer. Perhaps that's only ominous in hindsight.
Yeah.
But something that is not, that is practically ominous from the giddy-up is the fact that as he got a little bit older, he used to actively try to find roadkill on the, in the wooded area. He would take them off and he would apparently dissect the roadkill. Mm-hmm. Because this fascination with dead animals continued on into his later childhood. In fact, there was one incident when he had a dog that he was already dead from the road, and he cut the dog's head off and put it on a stake in the woods and then nailed the body of the dog to a tree. That's not normal. I never did that.
No.
That's starting to get into the point where you're like, okay, this is a bit much for a child. In October of 1966, so Jeffrey would have been about 6 years old, his family moved to Ohio. And that's where Lionel and Joyce had another child. And they actually let Jeffrey name their second son, and he chose the name David for his brother. So his younger brother was named David. Shortly thereafter, they moved to Bath, which is in Ohio. And it was there during a chicken dinner one night when Jeffrey, about 7 or 8 years old, asked his dad, the bones of this chicken, what would happen if you put them in bleach? And his dad thought, well, maybe, again, this is one of the things that's ominous in hindsight, but at the time his dad said he thought, well, maybe this kid has an interest in something like taxidermy or biology. So he took his son out to the shed and showed him like what you could do with bones if you put them in bleach, how they would turn white and it would help to preserve them in some which way or another. So, in hindsight, I'm sure Lionel looked at that and was like, oh God, was I promoting the wrong thing? But at the time, the kid was so reserved, they were probably just happy that he showed interest in anything, Eventually, Jeffrey Dahmer, went to Revere High School, and he started to come out of his shell a little bit in high school. He started to become a little bit of a class clown. And that was spurred on, I think, primarily by the fact that at that age, 14, 15, he was already boozing. Like he was dipping into the liquor cabinet. He was getting beer from wherever he was getting it to. His classmate would say that he would come 7 o'clock in the morning to homeroom and be pretty much sauced, So he was already obviously trying to bury something with alcohol, and a lot of that was probably his home life, the tension between his mother, and his father. Now, around that time period, he was hitting puberty, and the thing Jeffrey learned when he hit puberty was that he was gay. He had an attraction to other boys, and he got that pretty early, which in and of itself is perfectly fine. But also around that time, this strange thing happened, and no one really has an answer for it. But Jeffrey said later that somehow him understanding his own sexuality, however you can when you're in puberty, mingled with this dissection fascination, and he started to become interested in sexuality that involved violence and involved basically taking things apart. He said he was very interested in the idea of the human body and how it fit together, and that this mingled with his own sexuality, and it became arousing to him. I mean, this is a hard thing for me to even obviously articulate because I can't understand it myself. And perhaps he couldn't to its full extent, but he said this was around the time that the two came together, the idea of his sexuality and the idea of dissecting things. He also began to develop sexual fantasies that involved, amongst other things, a local jogger. He saw this jogger running through his neighborhood, and he started to have these fantasies about what if he could have that guy in some sort of submissive, unconscious state, and he could do things with him, sexual things. And this fantasy actually took him out to the roadside one morning with a baseball bat. Jeffrey crouched down in the woods by the road, and he waited for that jogger. And he thought in his mind, if this guy comes by, I'm going to clock him with this baseball bat, and I'm going to live out this fantasy. Not to kill him, but to, shall we say, do things with him while he's unconscious. Luckily for the jogger, he decided not to jog past that day for whatever reason, and Jeffrey didn't do it, and he never went out to the roadside again to try and bring this fantasy to life. Now, one of the things he became known for, there's a movie, I don't know if you've seen or heard about it, called My Friend Dahmer. Mm-hmm. And it's a pretty recent movie. It's a really good movie. If you're interested in watching a movie that is based around murder set pieces, then it's probably not the movie for you because there's no murder in the movie. But it's based on a graphic novel that was written and drawn by a friend of Jeffrey Dahmer's when he was a teenager. And it's about his relationship with the teenage Dahmer. And it's a really interesting movie. And it's an interesting graphic novel as well. And it basically is Jeffrey's teen years leading up to his first murder, and then it ends before he ever kills anybody. But one of the things that movie and that graphic novel talked about was the idea of doing a Dahmer. And amongst Jeffrey's friends in high school, this became a euphemism for his pranks, fueled by alcohol, that Jeffrey would often do to get attention for himself. I mean, I'm sure he was not getting a whole lot of attention at home. He just wanted to escape through alcohol. Well, here he could come to school, get good and loaded, and start acting crazy. And he would do seizures, and they would say, "Hey, Jeffrey, do a Dahmer." And he would act like, you know, he was spazzing out or doing all kinds of weird shit, and they'd all laugh and clap, and he would be like a class clown. And it gave him a sense of, I guess, belonging, right? I mean, we all know kids in school that have to find their niche somehow, and a lot of them do it by making fools of themselves. I personally did not do that. I didn't have the gumption to do that, but Jeffrey Dahmer, when he got drunk enough, had the gumption to do a Dahmer. 1978, his parents tried some counseling, ultimately didn't work out. They got divorced. Joyce, well, this is an interesting thing we could talk about. Lionel moved into a local motel there in town. Joyce took her youngest son and moved out of the house, but she didn't take Jeffrey. So at the age of 18, just a few weeks after his high school graduation, Jeffrey found himself living completely unsupervised. He was an adult legally, but he was alone. His mother basically abandoned him.
What, did they still own the house, or was he?
They owned the house. Well, I guess, yeah, they were making payments probably on it, but he wasn't working.
Okay.
So
I'm trying to figure out how, someone just out of high school is just.
Yeah, he's not paying for anything. He's unemployed, and he's just living in the house by himself with booze and pretty much nothing but time. Yeah. And I think maybe he needed something to occupy his time.
And the father didn't know he was.
No, the father was already, after the divorce, the father found another woman, and he was soon engaged to her, and then they stayed married, I believe, for the rest. He's still alive. I don't know if his if his second wife is still alive, because Lionel's 81 now, but they were married for years and years and years. So the second marriage for him worked. But Joyce, yeah, she just boogied on out. She boogied her crazy ass on out of there. And Jeffrey was just trapped. And he found something to occupy his time other than drinking, was to have fantasies. And unfortunately, one of these fantasies became reality, because he had this idea in his head that, imagine if one day I was driving down the road and I saw a hitchhiker and I found him attractive. What could I do? Could I pick him up and maybe take him back with me and have him stay with me, and then I wouldn't be lonely? And that's sort of a fantasy. Well, one day, June 18th, 1978, Jeffrey was driving in the car, and he saw a young teenage hitchhiker, 18-year-old guy about to turn 19, named Stephen Hicks, standing on the side of the road about a mile from his house. He was a straight fellow. Stephen Hicks was heterosexual. Jeffrey was attracted to him physically, and he pulled over and he just said, "Hey man, what are you doing?" And Stephen Hicks was on his way to a concert. He was hitchhiking. And Jeffrey was like, "Well, if you want to come back to my place, nobody's there and I got plenty of booze." And so Hicks was like, "Yeah, sure, why not?" So he jumps in the car with this seemingly innocuous, blonde-haired, blue-eyed guy who, is not being nutty or anything. And Jeffrey took Stephen Hicks back to the house, and they hung out for hours, talking, listening to music, drinking. And that was all good until Stephen decided he was ready to go. And Jeffrey had an adverse reaction to the idea of Stephen leaving. Abandoning him, perhaps. And so while Stephen was sitting on the couch, Jeffrey went into the bedroom and got a 10-pound barbell and walked into the room behind Stephen Hicks and whacked him over the head with it. And when Stephen Hicks fell to the ground, Jeffrey used the bar of the barbell to strangle him to death. So Jeffrey had murdered his first victim. Jeffrey was 18. He married someone his own age. At first, he didn't know what to do. And, he laid with the body and sort of did things over the body and satisfied himself sexually, to put it, in sort of a nice way. And then what he decided was, I can't have a body laying in my house. So he took the body into the crawl space under the house and he chopped it up. And there's no delicate way of putting this. And he put the body parts into garbage bags. And he put the bags that night into the car, and he started driving to the dump. And cop lights went off behind him. And Jeffrey was like, oh God, because he had already also been drinking, because he had to get himself drunk to chop up the body. Well, the cop pulls him over, and the cop says, son, what are you doing out this late? Why are you going over the center line? And Jeffrey was like, well, I'm sorry. I was just trying to get out of the house. My parents have been fighting, and I just thought I'd take this trash to the dump. And the cop looks in the back and sees the black trash bags, and he's like, well, I'll tell you what, if you just go home and wait on the trash later, I'll let you go with a warning. And Jeffrey was like, okay. And so right there, he could have gotten caught. But naturally, the cop is not thinking that there's body parts in those bags and that this, fairly nice looking teenage boy has murdered someone and chopped him up. So Jeffrey dodged a bullet there, took the body back, buried it in the backyard. About a week later, decided that wasn't such a good idea, dug it up and took some acid and pared the flesh and the meat and everything away from the bone, put the meat in the acid, and then he smashed up the bones with a sledgehammer, and then he took them out into the woods, and he said he stood there with the bones and he spun around in a circle and the bones fragments just flew everywhere. And so that was him getting rid of the body in its total form, which is something he would become quite accustomed to doing later. No one ever knew what happened to Stephen Hicks until many, many years later. Jeffrey kept looking at the newspaper, looking for stories about this missing boy, never saw anything. So he pretty much murdered someone and got away with it scot-free as an 18-year-old. And for the next 9 years, he murdered nobody. He wandered through his life pretty much without any sense of direction. 6 weeks after the murder, Lionel came back to the house with his fiance and found Jeffrey living there by himself and was like, "Where's your mother?" And Jeffrey was like, "Oh, she left a while back." So Lionel and his who would become his new wife, Jeffrey's stepmother, took Jeffrey in and tried to help him. He enrolled in Ohio State University, but the alcoholism worsened after the first murder. Jeffrey had a lot of secrets to keep now, and not just his sexuality. And so 3 months into his stay at Ohio State, he dropped out. So then Lionel, January 1979, says, "You know what would be good for you, Jeffrey? You need to go into the Army. That's going to make a man of you." And so Jeffrey was like, okay, not having any other direction in his life, being completely unemployed and a raging alcoholic, he went into the Army and was stationed in West Germany. But the alcoholism never went away. He tried to be a good soldier for a while. Alcohol came back into play, and he was ultimately deemed unfit for military service, but the United States Army was nice enough to discharge him honorably, in spite of the fact that he was, the aforementioned raging alcoholic. He did not want to go back and tell Lionel of his failure in the Army. He really didn't want to disappoint his father. So when they said, "Where do you want a plane ticket to?" when he was discharged, he said, "Miami, Florida." So he went as far away from Ohio and his father as he could, wound up living on the beach with no job, with little employment he could get, which was, ironically enough, at a delicatessen. He spent that money on booze. So he wound up basically sleeping on the beach until he got to a point where it's like, I can't survive this way. So he called his father, and his father said, "Okay, we're going to send you a plane ticket. You can come home." 2 weeks after he got home to Ohio, he was arrested for disorderly conduct because he got drunk in public. Now, this was pretty much the last straw for his father. He didn't see how to take this any further with his son. He felt probably a little bit useless. So they said, "You know what?" Lionel says this, "My mother has always had a way with Jeffrey, and Jeffrey always seemed like he really had affection for his grandmother. So I'm going to send him back to Wisconsin to live with my mother," which is what he did. Jeffrey went to live with his grandmother in Wisconsin. And everything went well. He did chores around the house. He didn't work for a while, but he was, out there trying to look for work. He eventually got a job at the Milwaukee Blood Plasma Center. And he maintained that job for a while, but he was laid off, and then for 2 years he was unemployed. On August 7th, 1982, the Wisconsin State Fair, he got drunk again, and he exposed himself to a bunch of children and some women, about 20 women and children. I guess he was just walking around the state fair and whipped it out, Beck, and was like, "Here it is, guys. What you think? You accept me?" And luckily, well, I don't know if this is luckily, but he kind of got off with a slap on the wrist. He got a $50 fine for indecent exposure, which is pretty, good for him. January 1985, he finally got a job as a mixer at the Milwaukee Ambrosia Chocolate Factory. And this was a job that he maintained for a long time. He worked 6 days a week. He had Saturdays off. He worked the night shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. By later that year, 1985, he started to frequent Milwaukee gay bars and bathhouses. He was still living with his grandmother at this time. And he became pretty popular in that crowd. It was like, "Oh, Jeffrey, look at him. He's kind of a hot stud, right? We kind of like this little blonde-haired, blue-eyed kid." But that mood sort of changed because June of '86, he began drugging the guys at the bathhouses and the gay bars. He had access to some sleeping pills. And Jeffrey started to he was roofing these guys. And after he roofied them, again, there's no way of being gentle about this. He would rape them or molest them. And a lot of cheeks were turned, but after 12 instances of this being revealed, basically the gay community, the bathhouses, and they just revoked his membership. They were like, "Look, you can't roofie the clientele, dude. You got to get out of here. We think you're cute, but get the fuck out of here, will you?" And so Jeffrey had no place to turn now, but to meet people, but the gay bars in Milwaukee. Now you have to remember, this is the mid '80s. And so, it's not, things are a little more loose than they were, say, in the 60s, where you could get arrested for being gay, but it's still kind of a subculture at this point. And a lot of people are living in the closet. So when a lot of these instances are happening in the gay community, in these bathhouses especially, a lot of other cheeks are being turned, especially by, say, the police. So Jeffrey was able to get away with roofing and molesting and raping quite a few guys using this little drug drink trick, which would become a staple of his for quite some time. August of '86, he was arrested, this time for masturbating in front of two 12-year-old boys by a river. He later said he was urinating. And the boys just happened to be standing there. Yet again, he kind of got away with a slap on the wrist. It was a little sterner than the $50 fine, but he got 1 year probation and some counseling. So, he had to. But this is the thing about Jeffrey, with his probation officer and stuff like that. He was pretty good at creating an air of normalcy. He was kind of an innocuous guy. And I think that's what got him off a lot of these things. People were like, yeah, he's kind of weird and he's doing horrible things in terms of drugging people and molesting them. But, he's kind of harmless. He's just a skinny little guy and he's kind of cute and blah, blah, blah. What's that face? Tell me what you're thinking.
It's just... That's just not normal. I don't care.
Which part?
He looks normal. No. Yeah. I think they have enough incidences to.
Do you think
unless they just didn't know about the previous ones. Did they know about the previous ones, or were they just?
Well, that's interesting because you do have, in that time that things weren't digitized.
Yeah.
So you did kind of have to still go with typewritten reports and stuff. And I'm sure enough crimes happen in Milwaukee of note that maybe they're not paying as much attention to this guy who's basically like a streaker, even though he's escalating from streaker into, kind of getting a little close with kiddies and then, of course, what he's doing in the bathhouses, which I don't even know if the police knew about that at all.
I was going to say, were those not even reported?
I don't think those were reported. No, I think he was pretty much getting away with that, which, numero uno problemo, because that's something that's a little worse than, running around the state fair and going, hey, look at my winky. This guy is like doing assaults on people. Now, the escalation we were just talking about, it went back to murder. It had been many years, but in November of 1987, in one of these gay bars, Jeffrey met a guy named Stephen Tuomi. And Stephen was about 25 years old. And at this point, Jeffrey had started to invite guys to spend the night with him in hotel rooms. He wasn't taking them home to his grandmother's house, but sometimes he'd fork out a few bucks and get a room for the night if he found a guy that he thought was particularly attractive. That's what he did at the Ambassador Hotel, November 20th of 1987 with with Stephen. He got a room. He was going to drug him and rape him. That was Jeffrey's intention. But something happened that night. And Jeffrey said later that he had no idea. He has no idea what happened because he doesn't remember it. He says he woke up the next morning and Stephen's body was draped over the side of the bed and he was bleeding out of his mouth. And Jeffrey said that he looked at his own forearms and saw they were badly bruised and deducted that at some point in the night he had beaten his lover to death, but said he had no memory of doing that at all. It was just he was shocked by it. He was shocked that he had done it, but he had to think fast because you're in a hotel room.
Yeah.
Now, modern day, you have hotels with cameras around every corner. Back then, you could still kind of get away with sneaking in and out. So what he did was he snuck out and he bought a large suitcase. And he took the suitcase back up to the room and he stuffed Stephen's body into the suitcase. And he got a cab and he threw the suitcase in the cab, took it back to his grandmother's house. Okay. Basically, what he did at his grandmother's house after a week's time was he cut the head and the arms and the legs off the torso of the body.
Now, where is he doing this at his grandmother's?
In the basement.
In the basement. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and he dumped all the body part. He had the acid that he had gotten in a barrel, and he put the body parts in there, melted them down, and then dumped that into his grandmother's trash. And he had all but the head. He kept Stephen's skull, which he boiled and cleaned, and just kept the actual skull itself. Everything else, I don't know what he did with it for a week.
And how does Grandma not notice something weird from the basement?
Yeah,
like an odor, or what's he doing down there?
She did start to notice an odor because this happened more than once.
Okay.
In fact, just 2 months later, he met a guy named James Dockstader, and he was a 14-year-old male prostitute. At 14, I don't really think you can call yourself a willing prostitute. I think more likely he was a runaway who was trying to make some money for himself. Well, Jeffrey came up to him and offered him $50 to take nude pictures of him. This is a ruse that Jeffrey would use several times, was that I'm a photographer, I'm going to take some professional photos for you or of you, and I'm going to pay you for them. Well, he took the boy back to his grandmother's house, took him down in the basement, strangled him, and kept him down there for a week before he dismembered this boy as well. Yeah, in the basement of his grandmother's house while she's upstairs. Now, he did the same thing, March 24th, 1988, to a guy he met in the gay bar. He offered him $50 to stay the night with him, took him to the grandmother's house, drugged him, and strangled him with a strap, and he dismembered him.
Grandma must have been watching a TV movie of the week. How does she not?
Grandma must have been fucking deaf. I mean, she must have been, I don't know what she was doing.
That's what I'm thinking. I'm like, how do you?
Like, she was very religious and stuff, you know. But she didn't seem to be very well aware of what was going on in her house. She seemed like she would be a good influence on him, but she was an older woman, so maybe, I don't know what she was doing, Beck. I mean, it's just kind of odd.
Yeah.
What's interesting, though, is in April of 1988, he lured a young guy to his grandmother's basement for the purpose of doing the same thing, and he drugged him. And this is going to the point of the grandmother, because this time when the guy passed out, the grandmother came to the basement and said, "Hey, Jeff, what are you doing down there?" And she saw Jeffrey with this guy in the basement. And Jeffrey was like, oh, he suddenly got second thoughts. He can't kill this guy. So lucky for this dude, while he was unconscious, Jeffrey threw him in the car, took him to the hospital, dumped him off at the hospital, and drove off. So this guy lucked out because Granny actually wasn't watching her stories or whatever, and was paying attention to what was going on in the basement, and just happened to notice him down there with a boy. This became a little bit of, because people didn't know Jeffrey was gay. He was not openly gay to his family, certainly not his grandmother. She was religious. She started to see him bringing home these boys, and obviously you're not thinking, well, of course Jeffrey's bringing them home to dismember and take their skulls, right? She's thinking, oh, they're doing something. They're doing something naughty, and I don't like that in my house. So that was sort of the underlying thing that was going on top of the fact that she started to smell things, because he was keeping corpses down there for like weeks at a time. Now, on September 26, 1988, he was arrested for molesting a 13-year-old boy that he had lured to his grandmother's house, and he was actually convicted this time. of second-degree sexual assault. So he had that. Some time went by, and 2 months before he was sentenced, in March of 1989, he met a 24-year-old guy named Anthony Sears, lured him to the house, drugged him, and strangled him. Now, with Anthony Sears, Jeffrey said he found him particularly attractive. He was like his type of guy.
Mm-hmm.
So he decided to keep more than just the skull of Anthony. He took his genitals,
Mm-hmm.
put them in acetone, and took off his head and put it in acetone. And then he put both into a little metal lockbox that he kept in his closet upstairs. Now, this kind of leads into an interesting story. A little side note that Lionel pointed out, the father, later. He came to visit his son, at Lionel's mother's house, Jeffrey's grandmother's house. And he noticed this box in the closet. And you have to keep in mind, Jeffrey is in trouble, and he's about to be sentenced for this second-degree sexual misconduct with the 13-year-old boy. And so Lionel is like, what do you got in that box? And he thought it's gay pornography. And Lionel is thinking, I don't want that in my mother's house. What if she comes across that box, opens it up, and finds, gay porn in her house? That's probably not something she's going to want to do or see. So he said, Jeffrey, I want you to open that box. I want you to show me what's in there. And Jeffrey knew what was in there. You know what was in there.
Mm-hmm.
It was Anthony Sears' head and genitals. But Jeffrey said, I can't have any privacy. This is a 1 foot square box, and I can't even have 1 foot square, box of privacy. I hate this. And him and his father got into an argument. His father said, you don't want to open it? Well, I'm going to take it downstairs and I'm going to open it. He grabs the thing, takes it down in the basement. Jeffrey's like, fine, just open it. Goes outside. Well, Jeffrey at some point within a few moments comes to his senses. But I think it's kind of interesting that at first he was like, yeah, just take it.
Yeah.
It was like he knew that the jig was up. That if his father opened that box, there's no way you can explain your way out of that.
No.
But for a moment, maybe he wanted to get caught. I don't know. What do you think?
Sounds like it.
Yeah.
He had a moment of, I'm tired of it. Just do it.
Yeah. And the father was going to crack that sucker open.
Now, I do have a question.
Mm-hmm.
With the charges against him, obviously his family knows about this.
Mm.
What were what was their reaction? Did his father talk about that in the book?
His father really he didn't talk too much about that. He seemed to be, there was a lot of denial going on.
Okay.
I don't think that they really wanted to see Jeffrey as a child molester.
Yeah.
Who wants to see your child as a child molester? Yeah. But there did seem to be a lot of denial. And that sense of denial kind of runs through even past the events of Jeffrey's life.
Okay.
Because even the mother later on in interviews and things seemed to be in real denial. Because she said there was nothing wrong with our family. There was no arguments. There was nothing out of the ordinary. And all evidence proves to the contrary, leading up to and including the fact that she just left her son to fend for himself and took the other son to a whole other state to live with some other family members. That says something. Mm-hmm. A mother doesn't just leave one son to fend for himself and say, well, screw you. I'm taking this kid and I'm leaving. That's not normal.
Yeah.
And you have to know that that's going to affect the way the kid. Now, I'm not trying to excuse any of this behavior or saying that it's the parent's fault, but you can't deny that sort of behavior does play a role in how you see yourself and how you see others. If your parent is going to abandon you and say, I don't need you, but I like this kid better, so I'm going to take him with me. Obviously, Jeffrey is affected by this. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't you think?
I would think so.
So, but anyway, the thing with the child molestation in '89 came to a head because he was sentenced ultimately to 5 years of probation and 1 year in a work kind of release program, where basically he was allowed to keep his job at the chocolate factory, But at night, he would have to come to the jail and sleep at the jail.
Okay.
And that.
And the box, there
Oh,
was nothing in the.
well, the box, he when he brought it back down to Lionel the next day, there was porn in there.
Okay.
So he had taken the head and the genitals out, but he kept them. He didn't throw them out because he liked Anthony Sears. So he kept those, but he did take them out of the box. Now, after the the work release thing, he decided that basically, I think what it was Lionel or Grandma said, it's time for you to go.
Yeah.
Like, you can't be doing this kind of stuff in my house. Because remember, he brought that 13-year-old boy to her house. That happened in the basement. So what happened was Jeffrey was kind of forced to move out on his own.
Which probably confirmed to her what had been going on with the other guys that she had been seeing.
Yeah, I'm sure she probably thought, well, they were being either consensually or otherwise. Funny business was going on in the basement. So it was time to leave Grandma's house. May 14th, 1990, Jeffrey moved to an apartment building on 924 North Street, apartment number 213. The work release program is behind him. He's living nights, he's working nights most of the time at the chocolate factory, but he's got his own place to go home to. Within a week of moving into this apartment, he meets a 32-year-old guy named Raymond Smith on the streets and strangles him, takes him back to the apartment, strangles him to death, boils his flesh, dismembers his body, takes his skull, spray paints it, puts it in a file cabinet with Anthony Sears' head, and starts to collect, starts to basically build a museum of body parts in his apartment, in his newfound apartment. May 27th, he lured another victim, but something funny happened this time. Well, I say funny. Something strange happened this time. He drugged two drinks, or he drugged one drink, and he had one for himself. Well, he drank the wrong thing. So Jeffrey drank the drugged thing accidentally, and he passed out with this guy. And Jeffrey wakes up and like $300 in his watch is gone. Like the guy took his shit, but he got away alive.
Yeah.
So in that situation, Jeffrey fucked himself over. And another guy lucked out. Someone who didn't luck out was Edward Smith in June. This time he made sure he gave him the right drink. And the guy was murdered by Jeffrey. And he tried to keep Edward Smith's bones, but he was doing some experiments with how to preserve things. Like, this is kind of gruesome, but he took Edward Smith's skull, and after he took the flesh and everything off, he put the skull in the oven because he thought it would dry it, and it exploded. So he tried all these experiments trying to keep this Edward Smith there, but he pretty much fucked it up. And he had to throw him out, which sounds horrible. I mean, this is a person, but he threw him away. 3 months later, he murdered a guy named Ernest Miller, who was 22. This time, the drugging didn't work, so he had to take a knife to this guy's throat, and he cut his throat and kept his skull. 3 weeks after that, you can see these are coming in pretty rapid succession, but he's got the place to himself now. A guy named David Thomas, 22. Jeffrey took him back to his house and realized, I'm not really attracted to this guy. So he drugged him. I guess he just wanted someone to be there, but this guy was not Jeffrey's type. So after he drugged him, he was like, I have no interest in this, because a lot of these bodies were being molested after they were killed. So him not having a physical attraction to this guy, he basically killed him because he thought he would be angry when he woke up. So the guy just was pretty much murdered, not to be kept or anything, but just because he brought someone back, drugged them. He's going to be pissed with me. And so Jeffrey just went ahead and killed him while he was unconscious. There was another 17-year-old in February of 91 who was the first in several human sex slave experiments. I mean, God, this is so horrible.
It just keeps morphing. It
just keeps morphing and getting more horrible. But with this poor 17-year-old guy, Jeffrey tried for the first time to take a drill a little hole in his head, put some acid in there, and he thought somehow that would make this guy a submissive sex slave, that he could just do whatever he wanted to with this guy's body. The guy died, though. I mean, it didn't work, obviously, because you can't really do that. Errol Lindsay was this heterosexual guy lured to the apartment. And he tried the experiment with him, and it totally just, the guy woke up, he was disoriented, but he was like, what time is it? Where am I? He was not a submissive sex slave, obviously, because just because you drill a hole in someone's head and put some acid in there doesn't mean they're just going to turn into a zombie. But that's what Jeffrey was trying to do. And so Jeffrey strangled Errol Lindsay. But around this time, the neighbors started to complain of some really strange smells because he was keeping these bodies. And when the landlord asked Jeffrey what's going on there, he said, I had a deep freezer and it broke and the meat spoiled. See, Jeffrey was really good at always doing this thing where he could talk his way out somehow of these things that you're like, obviously that's the smell of rotting flesh.
Yeah.
But he could talk his way out of it and people believed him. So he must not have been this just raving lunatic.
Did they never send like a maintenance man in? You know how sometimes in apartments they like, oh, we're doing this today. So we're sending people into your apartment.
I know they had maintenance people, but they obviously didn't come in there because there were bodies laying around. Like he had people in the bathtub in various states of dismemberment because some of these bodies were piling up. In other words, he wouldn't kill somebody and then get rid of them. He would kill them and keep them, and sometimes he would have another victim and then kill them and then have them too for a while. So it's not as if he was killing people and then getting rid of them. There was a sort of a layover in these murders.
It's kind of like hoarding.
Yeah, and he was creating sort of like a museum because he had an idea to build this shrine, and he was going to take all these skulls and take this table and make a shrine that had like these. He had a drawing of it. Which they found in his apartment. He never actually got around to doing it in toto, but that was his original idea because he thought that there was some sort of a demon at play in all of this that was inside of him. And he was really into that movie Exorcist 3, which is a really good horror movie. And it's terrible that it's gotten such flack because of Jeffrey Dahmer liking it. But that was one of his favorite movies. More about that later. Before we talk about that, we got to talk about a really interesting case of a guy named Korarak Synthophone. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He was a young Laos boy. He was 14 years old, and he was picked up by Jeffrey Dahmer. Something ironic about this fellow, this young boy, he actually was the brother of the 13-year-old Jeffrey molested. Not a purposeful thing. This was a completely random thing. Jeffrey happened to pick up the brother of the boy that he was convicted of molesting. And he took him back to his apartment. And again, this 14-year-old boy. And he did this zombie thing on him, still trying to make zombies out of people. He drilled a hole in his head, put acid in there. And then Jeffrey decided, I guess the guy passed out, and he thought, well, maybe this zombie will work. So he decided to leave and go get some more liquor. Well, when he's coming back home, he gets to the corner and he sees the guy standing on the corner, the 14-year-old boy. And he's standing there with 3 women who are pretty much hysterical because they're like, this boy is naked. And he's speaking, he was from Laos, this boy, and he was not speaking English with these ladies. So they didn't know what he was saying. I'm sure he was probably saying, save me, there's a fucking wacko drilling holes in my head. But because he couldn't articulate that in English, they didn't know what was going on. They just knew something was wrong. So these 3 nice ladies called the cops. Well, Jeffrey got there around the time that the cops got there. And he started to talk to the cops, and he told them, this is my boyfriend. Talking to this naked 17-year-old or naked 14-year-old boy with a hole in his head. He said, this is my boyfriend, and we're having an argument, and he's drunk. And, just don't take him to jail, blaming the victim. Let me take him back to my apartment, and everything will be okay. I'll take good care of him. And I'm thinking, yeah, I'm sure you will. You know what the cops do? They take him back to the apartment. These 2 cops take this boy who managed to get out while Jeffrey was gone back to Jeffrey's apartment, and they leave him there with Jeffrey Dahmer. And they go away thinking it's a lover's spat and making fun of the whole incident as if, ha ha ha, these two, saying some really derogatory things, which I won't repeat, about their sexual orientation. And the boy gets murdered. Jeffrey got him back from the police and murdered him. Now, that's not where it ended, because he murdered 4 other people between June of 91 and July of 91. I mean, he just kept going, because why wouldn't he? If you think
he just got somebody back from the police, he probably feels untouchable at this point.
That's right. Got him from the police. So how could you not?
That's got to be horrifying.
For the boy? Yeah.
Like, I got out. Help.
Yeah, and he can't communicate. He's disoriented because he's got a hole in his head. But then on top of that, with the language barrier, he can't tell these people what's going on. He's trying to, I'm sure. I mean, I'm sure he's just disoriented as fuck. I don't know what putting acid onto your brain does, but it doesn't make you a zombie. And anyway, Jeffrey got fired from his job because he started to be more preoccupied with these bodies and getting rid of them and doing things and experimenting with them than he was about going to work. So they fired him. And that was pretty much the beginning of the end, because now his source of income is over. The time in the apartment is limited because you got to pay your rent. You got to, buy food and everything. Well, and as in a last ditch, desperate effort to get, I guess, one more victim, on July 22nd, 1991, he approached 3 men and he offered, them $100 if one of them would come back and pose for photos. And this 32-year-old guy named Tracy Edwards took him up on it. Thought, oh, that's a nice-looking guy. He seems like a cool dude. So he went back to the apartment, and he was sitting there with Jeffrey in his apartment, and Jeffrey put on Exorcist Part 3. And Tracy Edwards said, he started to kind of rock back and forth. He was watching this movie. And he started to talk to himself and sort of chant to himself. But he said then he would snap back into normal guy mode and just kind of be huggy and kissy and listening to Tracy's heartbeat and stuff. But he would go back and forth between this sort of a character of a guy who's possessed or some sort of an occult, like a demon character. And then he would be Jeffrey again. And you imagine this must have been what all the other victims probably experienced. The only difference is that Tracy lived to tell the tale. But this was a 5-hour ordeal. They were sitting on the couch, and Jeffrey at one point got a knife and put it to Tracy's throat. And he said, I want to listen to your heart. And you know what I'm going to do after that? After that, I'm going to eat it. Because it's worth noting that around the time this was going on, Jeffrey had begun to try to eat the victims. Now, there's been a little bit of a discrepancy about this because he was not eating people the whole time. The eating came later. It became nearer the end because after the zombie stuff wasn't working and everything, he started to try and think of new ways of keeping these people with him because that was his big thing. He didn't want people to leave. He wanted to have them permanently. And as Jeffrey himself said, the killing was secondary to the idea of just keeping them. That's why he wanted living sex slaves that were zombies that could be submissive to him. He actually preferred them when they were alive. But if he had to kill them, he wanted to keep some part of them, hence the skulls, hence the bodies, hence the bones, and then hence the eating, because he thought that was a way of keeping them. Well, he had handcuffs. He had apparently full intentions of keeping Tracy Edwards. But Tracy was smart enough to be able to talk this guy, kind of down. Every time Jeffrey would start to get nuts, Tracy would kind of talk him down. I'm your friend, so forth. Eventually, Tracy said, I got to go to the bathroom. And he kind of stood up before Jeffrey did, and he took the opportunity to punch Jeffrey in the face. And he ran for the door, got out of the apartment, ran flag down the police. Well, the police come back, and Jeffrey goes into mode. He got away with it with the other guy. He's like, oh, I'm sorry. We were just having a lover's spat. And Tracy kept saying, no, he had a knife to my throat. You have to look around this apartment. And so the cops kind of said, well, can we look around, just look, just to humor this guy, talking about Tracy Edwards, the victim. And they did. And one of the cops noticed some Polaroid pictures, and he picked them up. And the Polaroid pictures were of dead and dismembered bodies posed. And he looked at Jeffrey and he said, are these for real? And at that point, Jeffrey snapped and went for the door, and they had to grab him. And he was fighting them and resisting them, and eventually they got him subdued. And then they slapped the handcuffs on him. And then they started to search the apartment, and that's when one of the cops actually opened the refrigerator. There's a famous story. The cop opened the freezer, and there's a head staring back at him, and he screamed. Because you open a fridge, you're not expecting the head to be staring back at you. And
expecting Tyson's chicken.
That's right, not Tyson.
Yes.
And so they found 4 severed heads, 7 skulls that had been either bleached or painted. They found 2 human hearts, a bicep. They found whole skeletons, severed hands, severed genitals, all these things in various parts of the house. He pretty much had a museum of morbid atrocities in his own house from all the many victims. So Jeffrey, being caught, was put on trial. January 30th, 1992, he was tried on 15 counts of first-degree murder in Milwaukee. There was no proving him innocent. Jeffrey said, I did it. He confessed. So the question was, are we going to sentence him to prison, or are we going to send him to an asylum? Is he insane or is he not? The question was never, is he guilty? I mean, I don't know how you would explain your way out of all this shit in your house, body parts and shit, but that wasn't even an option because he just said, I did it. So what they did is they brought in, this trial only lasted 2 weeks.
Wow.
And it was essentially, okay, where are we going to send him? And they brought in a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists, and he went through the whole battery of tests. And long story short, they determined that he knew right from wrong. He knew what he was doing, and he could stop these urges if he wanted to, but they said he chose not to. So what they determined based on that was that legally Jeffrey Dahmer was sane. And so February 15th, the jury said, okay, you're sane. That means you're going to have to go to the penitentiary. And he was given life in prison on 2 of the counts. It was actually life in prison plus, I think, 10 years on 2 of the counts. And then on the other counts, he was given life plus 70 years. So the death penalty wasn't an option in Wisconsin. They had abolished that like in the 1800s. So that was not. So he was going to go to prison basically for the rest of his life. He was also extradited to Ohio to be tried for Stephen Hicks's murder. Remember Stephen Hicks, the first victim, the hitchhiker. And that trial lasted all of 45 minutes.
Wow.
And he was given life in prison for Stephen Hicks. Now, he went back to Wisconsin to serve because, that's where the primary trial was. He was not being kept in Ohio, even though he was found guilty there. He was going to serve out his sentence in the Columbia Correctional Facility in Wisconsin. And first year, he was kept in solitary confinement. Perhaps they should have kept him there indefinitely because he wasn't in general population for a year before on November 28th, 1994. He was on work detail with 2 other inmates, a guy named Jesse Anderson and a guy named Christopher Scarver. And they were going into the showers to clean up. No guard supervision. The guards just pretty much let them go in there and clean the place up. Well, Christopher Scarvers, who many people said had schizophrenia, he had been charged and convicted with murder in 1990 with a single murder, and he was serving a life sentence as well. Well, he took a bar. It was about 20 inches long, and he attacked Jeffrey Dahmer and Jesse Anderson both in the shower. And Jeffrey was alive, and so was Mr. Anderson. They were rushed to the hospital, but Jeffrey died an hour later from his injuries. Basically, his skull was smashed in by this bar. Jesse Anderson died 2 days later. So both of the inmates that were attacked by Scarver ultimately died. Just Jeffrey died first and then the other. Now, Scarver said that the reason that he did this was as retaliation, because a lot of people in prison, don't have a huge regard for people who prey on the innocent and who prey on, not the innocent, but people who aren't able to defend themselves. Children. Jeffrey Dahmer was a child molester. He was known primarily as being a murderer of men and as being a cannibal, but he was also a child molester. And some of the people that he murdered were children, 14-year-old boys and so forth, more than one, So, yeah, I don't think there was a lot of love for Jeffrey. Now, some of the things Scarver said was he said that Jeffrey was always unrepentant. He said that Jeffrey would, like in the lunchroom like it's high school, in the cafeteria at prison, would take his food and like form the mashed potatoes into arms and legs and like put ketchup on it and say, "Look, I'm eating an arm." Now, I don't know how true that is. If Jeffrey was that sort of, I mean, I don't know. Luckily, I did not know Jeffrey Dahmer, and I would not have wanted to, frankly. I think it would have been an interesting interview. Instead, Stone Phillips did a very famous interview with Jeffrey Dahmer, and it was not long before he was murdered. And he interviewed Lionel, who was there with Jeffrey, and he interviewed Joyce, the mother, who didn't give a lot of interviews, but she did this Stone Phillips one. She didn't come across too well, honestly. But I didn't know her either. Point of the matter is, Jeffrey died. Jeffrey died as violently as he killed other people. What do you think about Jeffrey? Do you think that it was nature? Do you think it was nurture? Do you think it was a combination? What was his deal?
I can't even begin to say what his deal was. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just too bizarre.
Yeah, I mean,
everything that you've said, stuff with the parents and, just the stuff he does. I mean, no one raises their kid to do those kind of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of the things like with his father and stuff, you see interviews with him, he's not an emotional guy. In fact, if you put Jeffrey and his father side by side and you say which one's the serial killer, you probably pick Lionel, honestly. But anyway, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Oh, I was going to ask because, I mean, it's been a while since,
Mm-hmm.
What did they diagnose him as?
It was an unspecified. They had a name for it, but it was an unspecified personality disorder.
Okay.
They never could figure out exactly what he was, because they determined he was.
I'm surprised they just didn't want to study him or something.
I'm sure they probably kept his brain, because they like to do that with these serial killers, keep their brain, put them in a jar.
But I meant,
Yeah. No, I mean.
Put him somewhere, observe. Try to figure out how someone becomes like this. I don't know. I'm just.
Well, if you had him in an institution, you probably could have had that. But that he was just an average inmate, I think he would have had to, subject to that.
Yeah.
And
also, I'm sure it was just so gruesome. They just wanted to.
Yeah, just because they tore down the whole apartment building.
I was about to ask. I'm pretty sure you can't rent from there.
No.
Anymore.
It was torn down, and there are some really strange, murder memorabilia things. We won't get into that, but people tried to buy his. And what they did ultimately, which I think was probably the best solution to that, was they took a lot of the quote-unquote memorabilia, his possessions that were in the apartment, and they sold them at auction and then split it amongst the families of the victims, which I imagine that's probably the best thing you can do, because at least, the profits went toward people that had no say in the matter. They just lost people that they cared about, people who should not have been murdered. And trusted a guy who seemed innocuous. And
I'm sure those people were going to need counseling as well.
No, the families?
Yeah.
No.
I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I can't even imagine that. And there were many.
Home and being told someone in your family.
Yeah, has not only been murdered,
but how and what they did with them, and and on that, a very high profile case when you find out about it.
Yeah, and all the victims' names were, well, not the ones who got away, but the ones who were murdered, their names were released, and obviously they don't release the names of the 13-year-old boy that was molested and stuff like that for clear reasons. They never do that, but yeah, I mean, it's an awful case, and it's a pretty tough one. It's a tough one to talk about, because you do realize you're talking about real people, and these are some gruesome circumstances. And I've tried to kind of dial down some of the details, because it's actually, most of these murders were 10 times worse in terms of what happened to them after than what I mentioned even, and I mentioned some pretty gruesome things. But, that is the story of Jeffrey Dahmer. And I would like to hear what you guys think about the Dahmer case. Rebecca, I want to thank you for joining me today. This was an interesting thing to research and to talk about. I hope you guys enjoyed the show. We'll have more shows about true crime and serial killers and so forth as the months and weeks tick by. But until next week, I want you all to take care of yourselves. Have a happy Father's Day. We'll see you.